How often do you feel like you know exactly what to do, but you still don't do it? You keep reading books, going to workshops, listening to podcasts, but you are still stuck in the same patterns. What if the real key to transformation isn't your skill set or your knowledge, but how you're wired mentally? Welcome to Change Made Easy. Changing your habits, routines, and behaviors is hard. We make it easy. I'm Paul Leviton, and I help high achievers just like you who feel stuck to bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be. Traditional self-help doesn't work. It's either too rigid, too generic, or too overwhelming. My approach is different. I simplify change by making it so easy it can't not happen. Using my easier framework, I'll help you create habits, routines, and behaviors that stick, so you can stop struggling and start thriving. It's that easy. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Ryan Gottfredson. Ryan is a cutting-edge researcher, leadership consultant, and the author of several books, including his newest one called Becoming Better. Today, we discuss why real personal growth isn't about just adding skills, but rather upgrading your internal operating system, and what differentiates people who find real lifestyle transformation from those who stay stuck and frustrated. As Ryan points out, so many of us are constantly upgrading our doing side, as he calls it, being our knowledge, our tactics, and our tools. But as you'll hear right now, he explains why real transformation happens on the being side. Ryan and I also discuss why emotional intelligence isn't just a skill you learn, it's a capacity you build. We talk about why most adults never develop beyond their reactive programming, and what Ryan calls his 3 levels of growth, which he lays out in a step-by-step transformational plan that you can follow today. If you've ever wondered why knowing more doesn't always lead to doing better, this is exactly the episode for you. So please enjoy my conversation with Ryan Gottfredson. How do we become better?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question, but I think, and honestly, I'm not sure many people know how to become better. I know that I didn't up until really about, I'm going to say 5 years ago, that I really started to get clarity on how to become better. Now, don't get me wrong. I think everybody knows how to become incrementally better, but I'm not sure many people know how to become transformationally better. And so one of the things that I found really helpful is a fairly simple framework. And the framework involves visually think about a horizontal axis and think about a vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, we've got what I call our doing side. This is our talent, our knowledge, our skills, and our abilities. And I think we all relatively are in touch with our doing side. The other side of ourselves is what I call our being side. Our being side is the quality and sophistication of our body's internal operating system, how our body is literally programmed to operate. And what I found as I made this distinction is that, as I mentioned, most people are in touch with their doing side. When people try to improve, they largely focus on their doing side. So they, think about our education system, our schools, our athletic programs, our organizational development efforts are almost 100% focused on improving on our doing side. But what I find is that that's not where transformational growth occurs. If we see transformational growth, it always occurs with people upgrading their body's internal operating system, upgrading along their being side. And I think if we could just lay that out as the foundation, then it gives us some direction or clarity about what to focus on to truly become better. And that's our being side. Does that make sense?
Hey, real quick, we'll be back to the show in just a few seconds, but right now I have to ask you for a huge favor. If you're getting value out of this episode so far, take 2 seconds and share it with a friend. I mean, right now, literally, hit the little share button and send it in a text to your roommate or your cousin or your mom or your brother or your sister. Seriously, spread the love. If you like what you're hearing, then that's the best way that you can show support for this show. Because maybe you're like Eliza Kay, who said, "This podcast is both warm and inviting, but real enough to push and motivate me." Or you're like Dalton, who said, "Paul is an amazing host, and his podcast is a must listen." Don't you want to share this awesomeness with your friends and family? Don't be a gatekeeper. It only takes a second. It helps me grow and reach a new audience, and you seem like a genius friend who recommends new, awesome podcasts. We all win. All right, go send that text. And now let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I think that that's a very interesting distinction, but I want to backtrack just a second and maybe first talk about how you differentiate between, I think, as you put it, uh, the different forms of being better in general. It was like transformationally better and
Mm-hmm.
incrementally better.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you define those things? Because as you're saying, oh, I don't think that most people really know how to be better. The first thought that comes to my mind is, what does that even mean? How do I know what better is in order to seek it? Because in my coaching, something I talk about often is you don't hit a target that you didn't set out for. So, how do we define what better is in order that we can start to work towards that?
Yeah, no, great question. So let me bring up the concept of emotional intelligence. Might be something that's helpful to kind of sink our teeth into. So I think emotional intelligence is something that everybody values, everybody wants more of, and I think we largely kind of understand what it is. Now, if somebody is going to go be intentional about improving their emotional intelligence, commonly what we will see them do is we'll see them go to a workshop or go to a class that is involving instructing them to learn more about how to listen more effectively or how to be more empathetic. And then they'll walk through different tactics that we could do to do that. Right. So we're improving our knowledge and our skills around things like listening and empathy, for example. And it's one thing to know how to listen and have the skills to listen. It's also one thing to know what empathy is and have the skills to be empathetic. And I imagine, Paul, that you probably feel like me, in that I feel like I know how to listen. I know I have listened effectively in the past. I also feel like I know what empathy is, and I have demonstrated empathy at times. But there are certain times and conditions where I know that it's really hard for my body to listen and be present with somebody and truly be empathetic. And so I think that knowing about listening, knowing about empathy, it will be incrementally helpful. It's surely not going to hurt us, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have developed the capacity to be a great listener or be empathetic in situations where it's difficult to do so.
That makes a lot of sense. Uh, at the end there, you brought up capacity, and it's about building that ability to do something. There's that analogy of wisdom or knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing that you don't put it in a fruit salad. Right.
Yes.
So there's something about the difference between knowing theoretically, I can read a book, I can listen to a podcast, I can understand it logically,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to put it into practice. And if I'm understanding, that's a bit of what you're getting at with the being versus doing. So could you elaborate on, if I see that, I've read the books, I've done the podcasts, I've done all the things, and I'm still not I'm still not putting it into action in my life. I get home
Mm-hmm.
from a weekend seminar and I go back to being who I am. I finish the book and I go, that's cool. And then I go on to the next book. How do I start to transform into the person who actually embodies all of that knowledge that I have rattling around in my head?
Yeah, I want to get to some really practical things as you're asking for, but I think there's just a couple of other foundational ideas that just might help bridge the gap here. So, one of the things that I've learned is that if our being side, what we're really talking about is our body's internal operating system, or really our nervous system. And what I've learned is that our being side kind of ranges on a continuum. So people who are lower on their being side have a tendency to be more wired. Their nervous system is more wired for self-protection. And how that shows up is they're generally more reactive. They're more easily triggered. They have a more narrow window of tolerance. And so those are people that are lower on their being side. People that are higher on their being side, they're less wired for self protection and more wired for value creation. So they have a greater capacity to sit with temporary, uncomfortable emotions and not react to them, and instead intentionally respond to those situations in much more effective ways. So a very simple way is, how reactive are you? Right? How easily triggered are you? And surely certain things trigger certain people easily than, other people. But by and large, our being side is how reactive our body's nervous system is. And I think when we understand that, then we could jump into thinking about, well, what do we do to improve this? But before I jump there, let me just see if you want to add to anything to that.
Well, yeah, I think that that's actually a very important thing to highlight, and I'm glad that you brought that up for those listening, because it points to the fact that we are all built differently. You use the term wired, and I think of this like a character in a video game that has different stats. Like strength is this much, agility is this much, knowledge is this much. And I think that a lot of people, at least in my experience, naturally have this feeling of that we're all starting from the same place. So if so and so can do it, I should be able to as well. Or if so and so got there in 6 months, it should take me 6 months. Or if this person was able to accomplish this goal, that means inherently I am able to accomplish this goal too, because we are all humans and we are all given the same set of skills. And if anyone can do it, I can do it. Which I love that as an overall arching rah rah, we can do this mentality. But the reality is that we all start from different places and we all have different wirings, as you said. And that puts us at different points on the map. And some people begin with a distinct advantage. As you said, someone who's more wired towards being able to be in tune with some of these skills just out of the gate, not having been taught it, not having been trained in it. Some people are just more empathetic. Some people are better at slowing down and not getting emotional and having emotion take over. Those people will probably tend to see themselves with less instances of emotional eating, less emotional outbursts and getting fired from jobs and all of these different things, not because they are a better person or because there's anything better about them in a moral sense, but because they got the lucky draw when it comes to how they were programmed. Whereas someone else, maybe someone listening, would have to work very hard to get to that place. So I just appreciate you offering that up, because I think it's important to remind people that that is not a flaw in the system. That is just the reality of how we are built. And it's like knowing the rules of the game. If I don't understand that, it's going to be very hard for me to win the game. But now that we understand the rules, we are starting from a common ground, starting from a common place. And now wherever we are on that map, you, me, whoever is listening, we can start to move forward with an understanding of wherever I'm starting is unique to me, not this special place that everyone has the exact same potential and outputs.
Yes. And so let me put some labels to some of these factors that impact our being side altitude, or the sophistication of our body's internal operating system. So these are really broad buckets, but one bucket, as you somewhat alluded to, is genetic factors are going to play a role. So for example, ADHD is something that is largely driven by genetic factors, and ADHD is something that impacts our being side altitude. People who have ADHD are more inclined to self-protect as opposed to value create in terms of how their bodies are wired. So that's one bucket. Another bucket is our life's experience, right? What are the things that we've gone through? So one of the places where I do research is related to trauma. And what we found as it relates to trauma is that the more trauma one has experienced, our body's natural and our nervous system's natural reaction to that trauma is to wire us more for self-protection as a self-protective mechanism for navigating the rest of our life. And so that's part of our life's experience. One idea that kind of comes out of that is the reality is the wiring that we need to thrive as an adult, as a parent, as a spouse, as a leader, as a fill in the blank, is not the same wiring that we needed to survive our childhood. Right? So our upbringing has had an impact on our being side altitude. And then the third bucket is our current culture, right? If we're currently, for example, work at a certain place, if there is a lot of fear involved in that culture, we are going to become more wired for self-protection. If there is more safety in that culture, psychological safety, then we're going to naturally, our nervous system is going to be more willing to expand into that value creation space. So those are three broad factors: genetics, life experience, and current culture.
I love those buckets, and it's a great way to simplify this. I like that you're talking about creation and safety kind of being two sides of a coin, or two ends of the spectrum that we can be more geared towards. Could you explain a little bit about why those two are so closely related?
Yeah, so the idea is that the more safety we feel, psychological safety as well as physical safety, the more safety we feel, the less preoccupied our body feels like it needs to be focused on me and my safety, my survival, right? So if there are more threats in my environment, if there is more fear, and then I am going to naturally, my body's going to be more focused on me. But when I feel that safety, now it gives my body freedom to focus less on me and focus more on creating value in the world around me. I mean, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is kind of says that same thing, right? Is if I don't have food or shelter, well, naturally that's going to become my body's priority, is to get food or shelter, and it's not going to be on bigger things. So the reality is that if we could figure out a way to carve out safety in our lives, that's going to be one of the important things for us elevating our lives.
Right. So, as you said, this very much aligns with Maslow's hierarchy, where physical safety is the lowest level of the pyramid. It's the most necessary thing: food, shelter, safety. It's very hard to worry about philosophy when I don't know where my next meal is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as we move forward as a society, as a people, here in the year 2026, about to be, maybe when you're listening this, it is 2026, physiological safety for most of the Western world is more or less a foregone conclusion. We live with a level of maybe food insecurity or something like that for some people. But the reality is most people have shelter. We are not getting attacked by a lion. We are not getting tossed out into the cold. And yet that's what our body feels like. It's the signal being sent when we work in a workplace where there's a lot of strife is the same as being in the savannah and there's no horses left or something. I don't know
Yeah.
what the analogy
Yep.
is, but something like that. So
Yep.
the next inevitable question is, how do I train my body to understand the difference? Or how do I take control when I know logically I am theoretically safe, but my body doesn't understand that?
Yeah, no, great question. And this is, I would say, largely why I do what I do. Because as I mentioned earlier, I think we all know how to improve along our doing side. But what we're talking about here is improving along our being side. And this is why I said earlier, I'm not sure many people know how to do what you're talking about. And I think it's helpful, or what I found helpful, is to connect into research that stems from developmental psychology. And developmental psychology is all about how people develop throughout their lives, right? And for most of the history, developmental psychology is focused on childhood development. And what we know is about childhood development is as we go from infants to adults, we go through about 5 or so developmental stages, depending upon the framework we're looking at. And we do so almost automatically. And for the longest time, developmental psychologists assumed that we stopped developing when we hit adulthood. But that's not the case. So actually, back in the 1960s, there was a select few developmental psychologists. They're actually students of Maslow, so they're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But they started to investigate, can adults develop? And if so, do they go through different developmental stages? And what they found is super fascinating. So they found that yes, adults can develop, and there are 3 primary adult development stages. But what's so fascinating about this is what they found is that while adults can develop, most don't. So the research that's been done here is that if we've got these three different adult development stages, research has found that 64% of all adults operate at that base level, largely wired for self-protection. There's 35% that operate at the second level. And when people operate at this level, we're not wired so much for self-protection in terms of safety, comfort, and belonging, but we are wired in a self-focused way to stand out, advance, and get ahead. So we're now willing to be unsafe, uncomfortable, and not belong in order to stand out, advance, and get ahead. And so 35% operate there, and that only leaves 1% that operates at this top level. And at this top level, we're not wired to stand in. Our bodies aren't wired to stand out. Instead, our bodies are wired to contribute and create value for the world around us. So now we're less focused on ourselves and now more focused on creating value in the world around us. So I laid that out. I'm happy to dive into that framework more deeply, but just to give you a sense that there is actually a space that has focused quite a bit over the last 50 years on how we help people to develop along our being side. And let me just wrap up with a couple of terms. So as we've talked about doing side development, that's what we call horizontal development. And when we talk about elevating along our being side, that is what's called vertical development. And so if you really want to dive into how do we upgrade along our being side, the literature on vertical development, and there's not a lot out there, but there's enough to give us some really great insights about how we could go about upgrading our internal operating system.
I love all of that. I definitely do want to dive into those frameworks a little bit deeper. I just want to highlight what you were talking about, developmental psychology. And for those listening, again, I think this is super interesting because a lot of what I read and what I've studied and what I've been educated in is developmental psychology, behavioral psychology. But I read a lot personally on the child rearing side, like for books for parents, books for parents of kids with different disabilities and things like that. And people see me sometimes doing this and they ask why, because I'm not a parent. But it's because when you read these books, when you learn about developmental psychology, when you learn about rearing children, you see that that stuff is the exact same thing that they teach when you talk about helping an adult, which is also ironically, maybe funnily enough, the same thing they talk about training a dog. It's all the same stuff. The way that we raise a kid, raise an animal, or raise ourselves more or less follows the same guidelines because we're all just animals at the end of the day. And while there are different levels to it, obviously we're all in perfectly unique situations. It's this weird paradox where we're all perfectly unique individuals. We're all perfect snowflakes. No two are ever alike. And yet, when you strip everything away, we all have the same basic needs. We all are just humans at the end of the day. So I encourage anyone listening to do some research. I love what you talked about vertical versus horizontal growth, but just research into developmental psychology, into child rearing books and podcasts and things like that, and look at it with a lens of how does this apply to me? How does this mom talking about trying to get her kid to potty train, how can I apply that to me sticking to my diet? Because I guarantee you, if you start to look at it through that lens, you'll see a lot of crossover. But I just wanted to throw that out there, Ryan, before we lost it. But now I would love for you to go into a little bit more of the frameworks that you have around now helping us build, now that we've laid the foundation, helping us build vertically.
Yeah. So in my mind, there's 3 steps that we need to take in order for us to develop vertically or elevate along our being side. The first step is to understand that we have a being side and understand what that is. We've kind of covered that, at least at a surface level. The second step is then to evaluate what is my being side altitude. And that's a little bit more tricky. I've already given us some ideas that allow us to introspect about that. How reactive are we? How wired are we for self-protection? What is our width of our window of tolerance? Those are all things that we can consider. I actually have a couple of resources on my website, a couple of self-assessments. One's a mindset assessment and another one is a vertical development assessment. Both of those are designed to help us to evaluate our being side altitude. And so when we could get a sense of where we're at and have clarity what higher levels are, it now makes that path of development more clear for us. So those are a couple of frameworks as this vertical development framework, which looks at these three levels that I kind of talked through. But mindsets is another lens that I found that's really helpful, because ultimately our mindsets are intimately connected to our body's nervous system. And they're the things that determine how we interpret information in our world and how we respond to that information. So, for example, how would you say, Paul, that most people respond to constructive criticism? They get
um, frustrated or insulted, or it depends. But usually, even if they most people will want to take it well, but it still will sting them somewhere, even if they admit it or not.
Yeah, good. Right. So, as you say, I think most people get frustrated and therefore they'll get defensive, because what's going on here, and that's a knee jerk reaction. That's an automatic, non conscious reaction, because what's going on here is their body automatically, and it's their mindsets that automatically interpret this constructive criticism as an attack. And if our mindsets automatically interpret it as an attack, then of course we're going to get defensive. But we can upgrade our mindsets such that when we receive that constructive criticism, we see it not as an attack, but as an opportunity. And when we see it, when we could train our body to see it as an opportunity, then it allows our body to create the space to sit with it. That doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but if we could sit with that constructive criticism, it gives us the opportunity to learn and grow. Whereas we didn't have that opportunity when we would just react. So that's another kind of way, and hopefully you can kind of see that continuum from self-protection on the bottom side. That's that knee-jerk reaction to get defensive, to value creating, where we create space to sit with that. And all of that's regulated by our body's nervous system, with our mindsets kind of being the linchpin to that process.
I totally can see the progression, and how, as we raise ourselves vertically, we literally level up. I'm curious, how do you see it, either through your experience or through the research that you've done? Because you mentioned there's the mindset and then the body, and each plays a role in this. So, to use your example, someone gives me negative feedback, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
constructive criticism or them just being a dick, it doesn't matter. My body reacts in a way that my heart rate increases. It gives me a little bit of cortisol, or all these other stress reactions. My mind reacts of like, this guy is such a dick. Which is the cause and which is the effect?
Yeah, so great question. So, from a developmental perspective, of course, it is helpful for us to develop tools that can help us navigate these sticky situations in the moment. But if we want to, and that's kind of operating in a reactionary way to our development, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a little bit more reactionary. Another way to approach our development is, how do we develop our capacity such that the next time that this happens, I'm able to navigate this more effectively? And that's more about what vertical development is about. So I had previously kind of said there's 3 steps to elevating along our being side. I kind of brought up the first 2: connect with what our being side is, and that we have it, evaluate our being side, and now we could talk about how do we go about elevating along our being side. And I'm going to give you 3 different levels that we could think about this. I'm going to give you a surface level, deeper level, and deepest level. But one of the things that you're going to see across these different levels is, and this is what makes vertical development unique, all of these developmental practices are focused on upgrading our body's nervous system and helping us better regulate our body's nervous system. So, starting at the surface level, these are tactics that are generally kind of, we'll see them a lot in self-help books, and they are generally habits that we want to develop. So these are things like meditation, journaling, gratitude journaling, yoga, cold plunging, etc. Right? These are daily tactics. If we can engage in these, what we find is that over time, they help us to better regulate and connect into our body's nervous system. And so that's what I call our starter level strategies. So that's generally where most people start. And that opens up the door for us to do some deeper work. So at the deeper level, here is when we start to become familiar with the programming of our body's internal operating systems. And for me, in the work that I do with people and organizations, I focus on mindsets. I think mindsets is a great way for us to awaken to how our body is programmed to see, interpret, and respond to our world. But a really quick kind of gauge or activity we can do is we can craft what I'm going to call if-then statements. So, right, these are aspects of our programming that we want to identify. So, if, for example, I get cut off on the freeway, then how is my body programmed to respond? Or if I receive constructive criticism, then how is my body programmed to respond? And if we can awaken to this programming, it opens up the door to work on upgrading that programming. So that's at the deeper level. And then I'm not going to say that the deepest level is the place to start. We generally need to work our way down. But at the deepest level, this is when we start to bring in different therapy methodologies that have been designed to upgrade our body's nervous system. And so it's helpful to think about trauma therapy, literally healing our body from past trauma so that we're less wired for self-protection. There's neurofeedback therapy, which is starting to be found to be really productive for people with ADHD and other neurodivergencies, and a place where there's some research now coming out related to psychedelic assisted therapy that may be the most effective approach to healing and better regulating our body's nervous system. So I generally think that's not the place to start, but I think it's a place that many people need to get to ultimately if they want to elevate along their being side.
Yeah, it's great. I love how you start with the easiest, most attainable level. And I think that it's important to look at it that way because I think a lot of that stuff, journaling, meditating, cold plunges, yoga, these are like the common tropes. They're all good. These are the common things that immediately people say, have you tried journaling? Have you tried meditation? And they're great. Also, the most I don't want to say easy because they're still hard to do, but the most attainable right out of the gate. You can meditate right now. You can go to a yoga class today. But I think that highlighting that that's just the first step. Like that's the tip of the iceberg, because I think that that's where a lot of people where they stop, or that's their aspirational goal. I need to start going to yoga. I need to start meditating more. And it's like, that's great. We love that. I want you to do more of that, but to know that there is still deeper work if you want to truly get that transformational change, that transformational betterment that we've been speaking about since the beginning here. So I really appreciate you laying that foundation out for us, Ryan. The last two questions that I have for you, the same two questions that I ask every guest. And the first is, what is the change that you want to see in the world?
Yeah, I hope that message is coming out. And maybe just to almost summarize really what we've talked about is the change that I want to see is that we as a society become more aware of and more focused on our being side. And that doesn't mean that our doing side isn't valuable and important, but I just think that the ratio of emphasis is misaligned.
Yeah, that's great. I completely agree. And the last question, if you had one action step that listeners could take right now today, as soon as this episode ends, as soon as they take their headphones out, to start making whatever change they're making in their life just a little bit easier, what action could they take?
Well, it's connecting in with their being side, right? And we've talked about some of the things that they could do, like meditation, for example. Now, I know a lot of people stay away from that almost because they kind of sense, well, what do I gain from this, right? I'm not gaining any new knowledge. I'm not gaining any new skills. Well, that's because meditation isn't a doing side or horizontal development tactic. It's a being side tactic that's designed to regulate our body's nervous system. And so and if it's okay, if I'll give some shameless self plugs. If you really want to dive into this, I have a whole host of resources on my website. I mentioned the 2 assessments, and I just released a book called Becoming Better: The Groundbreaking Science of Personal Transformation, that goes into depth on everything that we've talked about here. So I'd like to think that those could be really helpful resources for folks.
Yeah, 100%. I'm very grateful for you offering those to everyone listening. I'm going to put links to those in the show notes. So anyone listening or watching who wants to check out any of those free resources, or I definitely highly recommend going and grabbing Ryan's book, you can just click the links and find all of that stuff. Ryan, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for creating the space. Thanks for creating this podcast. I don't think podcasters get enough thanks because there's a lot of hard work that goes on behind the scenes. And so appreciate your willingness to do that and invite me on. It means a lot.
Before you go, I just have to ask you for a huge favor. If you enjoyed or got value from this episode at all, then take a moment and leave a rating and review in the podcast app that you're listening or watching on. If you like the show and you want me to continue to create more episodes and be able to get awesome guests that will help make changing your life easier, then this is the best way you can show support. You can leave a 5-star review on iTunes like Eliza K, who said, "This podcast is both warm and inviting, but real enough to push and motivate me." Thank you, Eliza. Or you can be like Dalton, who said, "Paul is an amazing host and his podcast is a must listen." Thank you, Dalton. And thank you to all of the over 100 people who have taken the time to rate and review this show 5 stars on iTunes, or the dozens who have left 5-star reviews on Spotify. It only takes a minute, and it helps me grow, it helps me reach a new audience, and it lets me know that this is helping someone, which just feels good. All you have to do is go to the show page of whatever app you're listening to and hit the little 5 stars. Or go to the comments section on YouTube and boom, that's it. And if you really want to show love, take a screenshot when you do it and tag me in your stories on social media at Change Made Easy, and I'll shout you out in an upcoming episode. All right, go leave that rating, and I'll see you back here every Tuesday and Thursday with new episodes of Change Made Easy.